you're able to join us. We should go ahead and get started then. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good. I can.
And we have one other student. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Panna Garadini. I am I'm working on my bachelor's in communications through Washington University U College, which is the night school here at WashU.
Okay.
And I think I told you that because it's an online-only class, I can't require the students to be here at a particular time, but we are recording this, so they will all have to watch it, and they'll be able to use the material we get for other projects that they're doing during the semester. So thanks again. I appreciate you joining. And I'm not going to go through any sort of introduction because the students all have an introduction of you in the classroom that was written out with your background and links to find more information about you. So I thought I'd just jump in then and first point out that what I'm trying to do is ask questions that are kind of all in the context of the business side of communications. And I know your role has been largely on the editorial side, but I think over the course of your career, you've had a lot of visibility into what happens on the business side, and you probably have even more in the role that you're in now. How did you end up at Lion Publishers? What drew you to that role?
I was working as the vice president of strategy for a local news startup called Spirited Media, which was unable to raise a third round of funding and spun off its 3 local news properties to owners in those cities. And I left the company in that transition because they ran out of money to pay me.
Well, so how did the role at Lion come about, and why did you pursue that?
Sure. So Lion's been around since 2012, and for the first kind of iteration of its life, it's a national nonprofit that serves local journalism entrepreneurs, and did so through an active board of directors, all of whom were local publishers around the country. It was founded by a guy named Dylan Smith, who runs a website in Tucson, Arizona, that he founded when his local newspaper shut down, the Tucson Citizen. And he was the online editor for the Tucson Citizen and went and started his own website. And then the organization kind of grew out of a conference called Block by Block, which was created by Michelle McClellan, who's a scholar, and Debbie Gallant, who runs a kind of formative website called BaristaNet in New Jersey. The initial 30 or 40 publishers who gathered at that meeting formed what would become Local Independent Online News, or Lion. Lion hired its first executive director, a guy named Matt DiRenzo, and eventually, it had been attracting grants and got enough to hire an executive director. And then Matt was with the nonprofit for about 2.5 years, I want to say. He was recruited away to run all of Hearst's newspapers in Connecticut, both daily and weekly. And before he left, he had secured a $1 million grant from the Knight Foundation to grow our capacity over basically 2.5 years, or 2 years and change. So for me, coming out of Spirited Media, Billy Penn and the company that I had left, I was first the editor of Billy Penn and then an executive of the company that oversaw it. Billy Penn was a member of Lion Publishers. We were local independent publishers. So I had been in the space for 5 years prior. I was the employee number 1 at that company. So I was deeply familiar with the struggle to find sustainable business models for local independent publishers, like the one I had just worked for, and the chance to basically figure out what a 21st century journalism association would look like, because I could use that $1 million to hire a staff and develop programming, and it proved to be a really interesting challenge. To me, what I learned at Billy Penn was not just that I like doing local news, but that I like building things. I got to build 2 newsrooms in the space of the first 3.5 years while I was at Spirited. and I like doing that. I like building teams, and I like applying broad strategy stuff, and having the sort of runway to do that seemed interesting. The chance to kind of take the executive director role, which is probably the first time I've never reported to anybody directly. I report to a board of directors instead of one person, was also kind of attractive. I've liked being my own boss, basically. And I was kind of, I've worked for too many people over the course of my career, and Kurt might attest to this, who don't know what I do exactly. And that's terrible. I don't like that. So the chance to sort of, you know, I have people that I report to, but they all have other full-time jobs on the board of directors. And so that kind of freedom to operate and runway and scope of work seemed to me like a pretty worthy thing to do from a support perspective after spending 5 years kind of in the trenches, if all that makes sense.
Sure, yeah. I'm glad you brought up the grant from the Knight Foundation. It was March, I believe, and it was $1 million. And according to the blog post on your site, it's about, as you said, developing capacity and training members on core issues for sustainable local publishing. What are those issues?
Well,
but just a simple softball question with a simple answer, I'm sure.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, it's very easy. So it's $1 million, but it's not $1 million all at once. I actually just filled out the paperwork today to start that money moving, which is exciting. So if I look at Lion, we have basically 2 or 3 things we need to do over the course of this grant and another one that we're working with the Democracy Fund on. 2 or 3 things that we need to do with that money. Get Lion to sustainability as an organization. We have 250 members across the country, all of whom pay $150 a year to belong to Lion. So if you do that math, it works out to about $42,000 a year, which is not enough to pay for one staff member. We have a conference this year. It's in Nashville in next month, actually, the end of next month. And that conference has always broken even or lost a little bit of money for us. And those are the ways that we have of bringing money in on top of grants. And so what I need to do, how I saw the challenge when I first kind of landed and sized up the situation, is Lion needs to develop new lines of revenue as an association. Lion's members also need to develop new lines of revenue. I would say most of our members, so that 250 members, about 70% of them are for-profits and 30% are non, which is one thing that distinguishes us from INN, or the Institute for Nonprofit News, which is a similar support organization. INN got started 3 years before Lion and has a staff of, I want to say, 15. Lion got started 3 years later and has right now a staff of 3. And as of 2.5 months ago, that staff was 1, just me and some contractors. So I've already tripled the size of the organization since I started, which I'm very proud of. It's only been 5 months. Yeah, so as I look at Lions, as sort of sites with problems to solve, I can kind of bucket them in 3 ways. I can look at members who have made it, who are working with an endowment and are solidly doing strategic planning, who have exited and sold to a larger publisher, who have multiple sites operating in multiple regions around them. I'd say those are the sites that have made it. They have problems that small businesses face when they reach a certain maturity level, problems of succession, of training your employees when there's not that much room to move up or move around, of the problems that successful small mom and pop car dealerships or pizza places or whatever have. Because if you look at the definition of a small business in America, that's fewer than 100 people. And Kurt, I don't know if you can tell me any digital news organization that's a pure play local digital news that has more than 100 people. They don't. Even the Texas Tribune, which is as successful as they get, has fewer than 100 people. It's a small business.
Right.
So that's my sort of top bucket, right? My middle bucket are the ones that are making it, that are close to sustainability or there, unless they have a bad month, or maybe want to add a reporter to cover a new thing that might make them some money. They want to get into high school sports because they see money there, but they're afraid to make that investment. Or they want to introduce a new line of business and help serve maybe, small businesses in their community, but they're not real sure how to do that. And they're very afraid that if they take that risk, they'll be punished financially. Or, they're still creaking along, but they sure could use a new website because it's been a few years, and that money would be like the equivalent of a capital improvement project. They just don't have it laying around. That's my middle group, the ones that are making it. And then they're the ones that need to make it. Maybe they're just getting started. They're in a rough geographic area that doesn't have great internet penetration. They don't understand anything about the business side, or maybe vice versa. They don't know enough about the news. Or they don't know how to put together a media kit and start selling advertising and sponsorships. They've never done that before. So that's my ladder or funnel or whatever you want to say. It's our job as Lion to help our members move through that path to get to made it. And figure out how to solve problems common to all those places, right? Healthcare, or back-end services that can help multiple people, or cutting vendor deals because it's always too expensive to publish things. So how we can work with platforms or technology companies to help drive down the cost so that it's easier and faster to help people publish digitally. I like to say that my goal in growing Lion is to help more people start more things, create the conditions for more people to want to start local news businesses, because I don't think that what's going to be, what publishing is going to look like in 2, 3, 4 years will be like what it is today. For the same reasons that people never saw Snapchat or TikTok coming, local publishing needs its moments like that with entirely new forms of new local information providers. I think Billy Penn was one effort in that realm, but there need to be a lot more, and we're just not, the conditions are not great for people to go out there and do that. So if we can prove that local news is a good small business, more people will want to start local news businesses. So that's the challenge I've sort of set for myself, which is not a small one, mind you.
No, sure.
But it's one way you can fill a news desert more easily by making it an attractive proposition for an entrepreneur, rather than shouting from the rooftops that you're going to miss local newspapers when they're gone, right? I want to figure out the conditions under which more people would want to start something because it's good. It's good business. It's good for the community. It's good for democracy. It's just a good thing to do.
So you already debunked one of my assumptions about Lion.
Which is?
I guess I had this assumption that anybody who was a member kind of already was hip to how to do journalism and knew the content side, but was struggling to keep the lights on and to put food on the table at the end of every month.
So I would say that in order to join Lion, you need to have a certain editorial standard, right? That is true. But I do not think everyone is proficient at all of the things. So we have an internal members only Facebook group that I really can't talk too much about, other than to sort of say broadly, people ask each other questions all the time about what to do when you get a threatening letter from a lawyer, or what to do when you have a source who wants to stay anonymous but kind of outed themselves. How you treat that? How you treat the grieving parent who's complaining about coverage of their dead child? It's part questions and part support group, honestly. So yeah, I mean, I would say many of them know how to cover, let's put it a different way. Many of them might know how to cover city council, but aren't sure when there's a real big story, how they might handle it.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, in terms of the needs of the people who are members of Lion, would you say it's more about doing journalism, or is it more about keeping the lights on?
It's more about keeping the lights on with a healthy side serving of, why does the technology keep changing? This is really hard.
Yeah.
Because it does, right? Because it's often too hard or too expensive to do things. And the places that have the greatest influence on the audience are platforms that constantly change their rules. So,
give me an example.
If it's hard, Facebook's deciding to change the way that it treats pages because it's going to introduce the news tab and require local publishers to list their URLs and get their websites in good enough shape to list the URL. Facebook not allowing somebody to boost a post because it's a jobs post and they don't know that, publishers don't know they're not allowed to do that using the platform because it's buried deep in the terms of service and they changed since last time. So, you know, Google changing an algorithm in search and depressing local news things and favoring television stations that would write about a local story, even though the station's in Chicago and the event happened in Milwaukee. And I've got Milwaukee sites saying, wait a minute, why aren't we getting featured? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how do you keep up with those ever-changing regulations? How are you informed of those when they happen?
Well, sometimes we get a heads up. We have a relationship with a representative, with many representatives actually from both platforms. I got a heads up when the news tab information was coming down and kind of wrote a frequently answered questions post for our members that I ran, that I'm in the process of working with one of their representatives on so that I can tell my members how best to prepare themselves. We work with a place called the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University, which runs trainings for our members on best practices on Facebook. And usually that's the first place I send them. This is an arrangement that predated me before Lion had a staff to manage these things. But this is how our members can get training, and Facebook isn't barraged by 250 different voices. We run them through this program. It also helps us flag when things happen to a lot of people because there's a glitch, and Facebook can be glitchy. Problems can catch people up, you know, when they flip a switch they didn't mean to, and it's just software at the end of the day, and software often has bugs.
Sure. So part of what I'm hearing you say is that the people who are members of Lion have to come to realize that what they came to do is journalism, but the truth is journalism is a minority percentage of the stuff they have to do in order to keep their business running.
I mean, I think that's true. I think it's never been as easy as we just write stories and figuring out how to make money on them as someone else's problem. I think look, it's a different type of person who becomes a local news entrepreneur. A lot of people are always going to want to work for somebody else. What goes along with being an entrepreneur, I learned, and Billy Penn was, you know, an outlier, right? We had kind of a lot of money to get started. I didn't have my own personal skin in the game. I was lucky enough to get a salary the whole time. But even so, when you're in that position, at the end of the day, it's just you. You don't have a business side. You don't have an HR department. You don't have facilities management. It's you. So when, you know, you're checking people in at an event, and then you're turning around and making a speech at that event and making sure everyone's got their IDs on, or maybe you're pouring drinks at that event that you're later expected to give a speech in. It's the amount of stuff that goes on when you're the person who's it's a small team running these things. And Lions tend to be small teams. I mean, I talked about 100, but hell, most of ours are 4, 5, or 6 people. So when I say small businesses, I mean like small family neighborhood businesses. Mm-hmm. So the part of it that shouldn't be surprising to people is if you have a digital business, you have to stay up on digital, right? And platforms have so thoroughly changed the way people find information, whether it's coming to them in a feed through a social network, coming to them through search, coming to them through an algorithm in YouTube, right? Is entirely different even than when I started in digital 20 years ago. Keeping up with that stuff is just part of the job. And I think our members kind of understand that. It's just that has gotten so much more important as the platforms have become so dominant, right? We talk about our audiences, but in many ways they're the platform's audiences, and we're just borrowing them for a little while. It's you know, even odds whether most of a site's traffic will come through Facebook or Google, and then down the list, their own URL, their own emails, and on down the line, which is why it's becoming more important for people to start building their own connection with that audience, largely through email newsletters. I had taken that as an established fact when I took this job 5 months ago, but there are still members in Lion who are not sure whether it's good for them to start an email newsletter. And I can't think of anything that's more basic for them to do. So
Yeah.
the other thing about Lions is, when you've been running a site since 2012, 2009, 2010, those are some of the first people to leave newspapers. And so when they developed their sites, they haven't changed them much since they launched. Maybe because they can't afford to, because that stuff's expensive. Maybe because they don't want to, because they found something they thought works. But then you'll run into sites that don't work on people's phones, which is not a great thing either, So there's a lot of problems that I can try to help solve for our members, I think.
Yeah. So what's a day
the
in the life
independent
of?
part.
I was going to say,
man.
what's a day in
Today,
the life of Chris Krewson?
Sure. Today I was on the phone with somebody from a. So some of it's dealing with member issues and problems and questions. Some of it is offering our members, keeping our members up to date, I guess, on stuff that will help their business, whether it's applying for grant opportunities or training or awards or things like that. Right now, a lot of my life is moving towards putting this conference on next month in Nashville. So dealing with vendors and site visits and sponsors and wrangling the whole thing to the ground, because it's 3 days worth of trainings and conversations and keynotes and how to market and promote that and sell tickets is a lot. Today I had a call with somebody who wants to offer their tech platform, which is basically like a really fancy way to do slideshows and video and multimedia, find a way for them to reach our members. And maybe the only way that our members could afford to do this is with grant funding. So figuring out what it might look like for that to work out as an opportunity for our members to maybe have a sexier way to do rich media on their sites and theoretically attract more sponsorship money because the presentation looks nicer. That was a call that I spent an hour on today, and about halfway through I understood what the guy was asking me. But he was referred to me from our biggest funder, and so that's a call I had to take.
Yeah.
I had a half an hour call. Yeah, go ahead.
So no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I had a half an hour call with the new head of news monetization at Facebook, who was asking me a lot of questions about our local publishers and pain points and where they could use help and what Facebook might be working on that might help them and why not. And that was another call that I had today. And then I had to stop and sign the document that would start the night money moving towards us. So I kind of dropped everything else to do that, right? So I can keep paying my people.
And yourself.
And also make sure, and also myself, yeah, I had to figure that out first. And also make sure that the paperwork was correctly filled out for our health insurance, which starts on October 1st. And we have kind of a glitchy payroll system, but because my director of programming is in Seattle, my director of revenue and operations is in Vermont, and I'm outside Philadelphia, I needed to find a payroll system that could pay everybody in those disparate locations. And that was kind of a huge pain in the butt a month and a half ago. And it turns out it's really kind of glitchy, and you almost need a full-time bookkeeper to help you ram things through from time to time, which is what happened today. So it's also dealing with the entrepreneurial part of being a small nonprofit startup. And that's essentially what we are. Even though we've been around since 2012, this is the first time we've had more than one full-time staffer. The first time we've been able to, so I'm facing a lot of the same entrepreneurial issues as our members. It's really this weird kind of parallel thing going on.
Sure.
Other days, I work on big picture stuff and get to spend 2 hours brainstorming about news entrepreneurialism at Google headquarters in New York City, which was really cool. Those are the days I really like. Dealing with the insurance stuff, not so much.
Yeah. Is Lion positioned in such a way that as an organization, you can create economies of scale for your members? Or am I assigning things to you that you're not in a position to do?
If you mean, are we in a deal to or a position to help cut a deal with a vendor or something? The answer is maybe.
Okay.
I think the I in Lion, which stands for independent, gets taken really, really seriously by our members. So I can't ever speak on behalf of all 250 that they will all do something. But I can certainly offer something to all 250 and see who wants to do it. They take that independence, you know, as a given, and really want to make sure that they can be the final arbiters in their domains.
Sure.
So it's not the same as, you know, rolling out one thing on, God forbid, a network of patch sites, which they still have very strong anti-feelings against, right?
Right.
It's never going to be that. But the nice part is you have Lions who experiment in all different kinds of ways with all different kinds of story forms or designs or approaches. And, you know, for every 3 that will never get into programmatic advertising, I've got 2 that swear by it. So, you know. Does
that independence apply on both the business side and the editorial side? Like if you could bring a solution to a bunch of independent publishers to help them display ads or take donations or any of those sorts of business side functions that you could get some sort of economies of scale on. Is that the same?
Yeah, I mean,
do they feel the same way about that as the editorial independence?
Oh, it's independent. It's total independence. I mean, so we're running a program right now through Google called it's an ad accelerator program where we had offered the ability to basically have Google a WordPress agency that was contracted by Google, so no cost to the member, to redesign their ad stacks on their websites and try out new forms of advertising Google's developing to see if they can increase revenue by changing some things around that our sites probably wouldn't have the money to do themselves. And so we had 7 sites sign up for this, and not to flog my conference, but we're going to find out how they did, how this is working at my conference next month. And that's something that Google was interested in us because we were a gateway to a bunch of publishers that have pretty unique problems. I mean, large publishers have problems with advertisements as well, but they've got a much bigger development staff and sales staff to deal with them. So I think that's why Google was interested in working with Lion members and having us be the intermediary that connected them, the platform, to the publishers.
Okay. So ahead of time, I had asked our students who couldn't be here in the event to send questions that they might like me to ask. And one of them, Kimberly Langley, wanted to know, how do you officially become a journalist in the eyes of your organization?
In the eyes of, how do you become a Lion member?
Yeah, well, maybe that's the better way to ask it. How do you become a member of Lion, and how does Lion, you said, you alluded earlier to something about having some sort of standards. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, there's a process. There's a process, and it's changing a little bit to kind of understand the times. So Lion used to mean every letter was as important as the next. Local, independent, online news publishers, you had to check every one of those boxes in order to join Lion. So if you had any kind of print component, you couldn't join. If you covered a whole bunch of communities, you couldn't join. And some of that's changing a little bit. The online only is not as important because we're trying to find, we think we can help publishers, especially ethnic publishers, who might not understand the internet but want to keep publishing and understand that going digital only is the way they're going to have to survive. And I think we can become a support organization for them because I really don't see any other organization there to do that work. But the independent part is very important. The publisher's part is very important. They have to be the decision maker, the actual publisher in their shop. Now, a lot of these are editor/publishers because they're too small to have a separate business side, although some of them do. in order to join Lion, there's a form, but when you fill the form out, you don't join automatically. That form gets sent in and gets reviewed. And we look at your site and the information you provide us, and we click around and see, are you following generally accepted practices in journalism? If you're, a site that aggregates, are you actively ripping somebody else off? And if so, we won't allow you to join. We don't really run into the problem of overly partisan websites because it's a local news thing, and so far that really hasn't been a concern. I will say that some sites that are Lions tend to be a little more boostery, a little more pro-community than maybe a straight-ahead newspaper site, but that's also kind of a function of, we have people who come out of like the shopper world or the Yellow Pages type publications that are, we have several sites called we have like a What's Up Newport site for Rhode Island where it's really a calendar, right? And I would almost put the Where By Us sites in that bucket too, where it's an email, the main point of the publication is an email newsletter. They also have a website, but the point is to reach people in their inbox. We have a member called Detour Detroit that's very similar in that the newsletter is primarily the way that they publish and the easiest thing for them to monetize.
Okay.
But yeah,
another question.
We review those.
Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead. No, I was just going to say we review those and then I pass them on to the board with sites that I recommend be allowed to join Lion, and the board has a week to veto any sites I've chosen. If I don't hear back, then I allow the sites in.
Got it. Samantha Solomon asks if your organization has any sort of, do you facilitate the expansion of access into lower socioeconomic neighborhoods to news?
Well, that's honestly what I'm most excited to do. When I talk about creating conditions for more things to start, I think specifically that's an effort that we can bring into communities that technically probably aren't news deserts, but also probably haven't seen a reporter from a newspaper, magazine, or radio station or TV station unless something bad happens. And so I'm really excited to start figuring out how to create that landscape, which I think is partly tools, but also partly humans. And it means going into those communities, not bringing them to us, helping to choose facilitators, trainers, and coaches who look like the audiences that they want to serve, right? Who ideally come from those communities, and helping provide access to funding so that people can get started. And that's, it's not a tomorrow solution, but I think that's ultimately how we start to move the needle on these things, by helping to facilitate the creation of new things where there were no things before. And honestly, if you look at the problems, there's a lot of problems in sort of modern media, but figuring out how to take seedlings or fertilize the ground or whatever other gardening metaphor you want to use, that's where I think the opportunity for Lion is. I want to grow Lion by creating new lions. And that's something that I've had some early interest from funders around. They're excited about being in a position to enable this work, and they understand the importance, especially of representation and inclusion in that process.
That's really fascinating, and it's great to hear, because it sounds like what you're trying to do is expand from a model where I can only be a member of Lion if I've already started my site and I've already established myself. Whereas there might need to be a pathway for somebody who says, look, I see an opportunity in my community, but I'm starting from ground zero and I need help. Could you be a resource?
Yep. Yeah, one of the things that frankly, I've asked for money for is something we're calling the starter pack, which is not a long list of articles to read and wade through, but a tool that responds to people's needs as they have them. You know, it sounds like you want to start a news site. Have you gotten your business license yet? Have you decided, you know, are you going to be a nonprofit or a for-profit? If you're a nonprofit, you need to form a board of directors. You need to apply to the IRS. If you're, you know, so walking people through the process, not just the legalities of it, but also the technology of it, and also the, you know, helping people find funding for it. Have it be an interactive tool that responds to the questions that they have, with the opportunity for them to contact someone who could answer a question if they have it, right? And then ideally, find ways for those people to connect with each other on the journey. And this tool I'm envisioning is going to be free. And the implicit understanding is, well, I really want to join Lion because these guys have a lot of answers to questions. So that's my best membership pitch, is join because we have all these answers already in our community.
Sure.
I don't have that yet. I'm envisioning this as something that will be more and more in need as newspapers begin shedding more and more reporters, which is inevitable. But also in communities, like I said, that need to answer some of this stuff for themselves. And if we can be there with support, funding, you know, training, coaches, then it's even stronger argument that our organization, and it helps add relevancy. Like it makes the value proposition of Lion really clear if we're facilitating the creation of new things and not just encouraging new things to join us.
Great. I have a sense that Panna may have a question here.
I do. So I guess my question to you is, how do you help your clients' websites target their advertising for them? So do you do any type of research to find out what their main target audience is and then help them target those ads toward that group?
So technically we're a 501c3, which is a public charity. We're not like a business association. And I, you know, frankly, I have no idea what a lot of my members use to serve their ads. I wouldn't know how to begin helping them with that.
I gotcha.
We're there like as a support organization that provides training or access to maybe like a group discount on something, or you know, we can offer recommendations about what tools our members are using, but we don't actually use the tools ourselves. We're an association, not a publisher.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
So let's step back a little bit from just this, your position in this role, and kind of reflecting over your career from print to digital and now to this role. You've had a lot of perspective on different ways publishers have been able to monetize the work that they do. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the ways that seem to be the most promising, or perhaps could be promising given enough time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the prevailing sense today is that focusing too much on display advertising of any kind is a bad thing. I think that sites that are beginning to monetize their relationship with their audience, whether it's through a membership program or a subscription or a paid service like a paid newsletter or something, or events, or be the way this is all moving today, whether you're a big site or a small one. I don't know that that's going to be enough. And so it seems to me that, I mean, the part of the reason that I think we need to find more ways of doing things is because we need to find more things that are going to work. And I need to develop more revenue streams for members in general. So there were some commonalities, some things that make sense for a lot of people to do. I have witnessed the extreme of that when I was in Hollywood. You know, I spent 4 years at Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, and trade publishing in Hollywood is is an interesting ecosystem. And I brought a lot of those tricks back to Billy Penn and monetized content in a way that was not just, here is an ad, here is a story, but like lists of people are, listing the next generation of people about to change something or whatever, wound up being a pretty great way to earn money in all of our cities whenever we unveiled it at Spirited Media. And so that was something that, like, applying trade publishing techniques in a local digital space was one of the things that Billy Penn did that really didn't get a whole lot of attention. We did a whole lot of things. But I'm not sure people paid attention to the fact that we were applying a very old standard. I mean, the top 10 artists to watch in Variety, right? Or the 10 producers to watch, or the cinematographer of the year or whatever, were all ways to basically make money by writing about somebody and then asking a lot of people to take out advertising, congratulating their client. And in Billy Penn, we called those Who's Next lists. We did once a month, and they started making money from the first day. So I think we need more ideas like that. I don't necessarily think we need to reinvent the wheel. With that said, I think there are ways for us to figure out how to make the experience of local publishing better, whether that's figuring out the local version of the Wirecutter, figuring out like a local affiliate program that lets sites that write about things often, whether it's a concert at a local venue or a special at a restaurant or a good or service that's developed in your town, figuring out how to, if you write about that service, facilitate that transaction and then take a piece of that transaction. Seems like an interesting way to start generating revenue. Maybe not a ton, but as everyone kind of knows, every little bit helps. I think that's where this seems to be going at this point. Looping all that in as people become more comfortable on their phones, and phones, if they remain the dominant way people access news and information, figuring out how all that works in a phone context with location-aware services and publishing that can tell you when something is happening near where you are, could be a hugely valuable service if we can stay ahead of the technology and figure out how to make it a tangible value in our users' lives.
Do you feel like publishers have some role or some imperative to work with companies, brands, to help them reach an audience, to help them get their message out?
I mean, are you kind of asking me, are branding studios a good idea? And sponsored content, that kind of stuff?
Well, that could be one part of my question, but yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, I'm of two minds on that. One is that obviously every little bit helps, but two is I think Columbia did a report not too long ago, maybe it was CJR, about how all these sponsored content things are, and I can't help but thinking that this looks a lot like the Pivot to Video did, which is something that shows a lot of initial promise, and everyone kind of floods the zone, and when a lot of people start doing it, the value of it goes down, and in 2 years it's over. It's maybe not quite that dire, but it's very clearly trading on access and ability to buy a publisher's explicit. They're buying the name of the publisher with work that's not up to the publisher standard and is very clearly advertising content in the large amount of cases. So I'm never going to tell somebody not to cash the check, because you should cash the check, but I don't know how sustainable that's going to be 2-3 years in the future.
Sure. And that's great perspective, because I think we are going to, I don't think we are going to be talking a little bit about that later in the semester, some of these sorts of ways that, but I think more broadly, my question was about, let's just get down right to the micro level. So I'm a publisher of a local news site in my community, and part of the reason I got into this is because I felt like my community needs a better source of information about what's going on here. But part of my imperative is that I have to keep the lights on if I'm going to do that. So do I have some sort of role to partner with the brands, the companies, the potential advertisers that would perhaps like to have access somehow to my audience, because I have aggregated eyeballs in a certain way, or so that's really what my question is about. And where have you seen those partnerships work, or have you?
Well, we have, I mean, yeah, a lot of our local audiences, our local publishers, depend on selling advertising, depend on connecting their local audiences with local merchants and vendors. I have also seen a lot of merchants and vendors try to take advantage of low rates or get free advertising, or just, seen people sort of, I mean, everything's so in flux right now that they're less, the actual vendors in a very small town, it's easier to do. The bigger the town gets, the more you get agencies in the way, and the smarter those people think they are. But, they're dealing with just as much disruption as anybody else. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that most Lions earn most of their money through advertising, through a traditional sales relationship. Some Lions have developed interesting to me side businesses. We've got a guy out in, I want to say, Nebraska somewhere, who built like a separate digital marketing agency that helps small businesses with their social media and their online presence. And that's what helps underwrite his newsroom.
That's
so
fascinating.
It's less,
that's really kind of going to the heart of my question.
Yeah, it's less, here is an advertisement for my audience that you will see or you will not see, or you will close or scroll past, versus I am helping you to connect with your audience because I know how to connect to a local audience. And it's leveraging expertise more than it's selling an impression, the value of which, like, let's be honest, anybody who pays themselves or a reporter to publish a story, the cost of creating that story and placing an advertisement next to it is always going to be higher than if that advertiser chooses to advertise on Google or Facebook. Because Google or Facebook's cost to serve something up next to that ad is zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
Facebook, if you want to advertise with Facebook and you want to reach left-handed ping pong players in your town, you can do that. And Facebook will only charge you to reach those people. You will only reach those people, and Facebook has paid $0 for the content next to which that ad runs. Google will only charge you if someone clicks on the ad somebody buys next to a search that happens. So you could set up 1,000 campaigns, only one of which you would ever actually pay for, right? Which is a far better deal than a local publisher who is aggregating an audience that maybe cares about the local community, but maybe not that ad or the content of that ad.
Yeah.
But creating a business around connecting people to local audiences is a more holistic way of thinking about publishing. It's not just writing the news, it's connecting people in a community. And if you're leveraging that service to help local merchants, that seems to me to be like a more holistic way of solving the problem and also doing good at the same time.
Yeah, you've actually framed this much better than I articulated it. And that's really what I was driving at. These sorts of, and that's a wonderful example, the Nebraska example that you mentioned. This idea of driving engagement between audiences. I mean, the simpler version of it is what you were talking about before regarding events. In a previous class, a previous semester of this class, I had your former boss, Jim Brady, on, and he was talking about what you were trying to do at Billy Penn to create events, because you you at Billy Penn had the ability to create an event that would drive interest among an audience, and potentially sponsors of that event would like to reach those same people. Is that sort of the
Yeah,
model that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's part of it. But the other thing about events when Billy Penn was very young is that we didn't really have an audience, right? Like we had very low page views, we had very low uniques. And so it was much easier for us to fill up a room with the right kind of crowd, charge for tickets maybe, but charge sponsors to reach the right kind of people. And then that event had everything that the internet didn't have. It had scarcity. The room could only hold so many people. The hours could only be so many during which signage would be displayed. You know, it's not like a story that goes viral and all of a sudden the price of an ad drops because the story is infinite, right? It's just a web page. An event has scarcity, which if it goes well, you can charge more for the next time you do it. It seemed to solve a lot of those problems, but you know, the sort of flaw in that plan was that we never really made events a great business by investing in them and then promoting them, because by the time we started trying to figure out how to do that, we had launched in other cities and we had product needs and there were other, you know, alas and alack, basically.
Yeah. So another student joined us a few minutes ago, but I can't tell for sure if she's just listening or if she has audio and video on her end. So I'm going to pause and say, Tia, if you have audio and you want to ask a question, the time is now. I'm hearing something, but not a question yet. Just break in if you have something, Tia. So while I'm waiting for that, I'll just go back to this point again. It sounds like, Chris, what we're talking about a little bit here is this idea of, maybe partner isn't the right word, but being a publisher in this day and age is a little bit about being a consultant. You're working on one side to create a product that puts out information and informs, but on the other side, in order to have a sustainable business model, you have to be willing and able to consult with the potential supporters of your work to help them reach an audience that will help you keep the lights on.
Well, that's a way to look at it. I would also say, here, hang on 1 second, okay?
Yeah.
Sorry.
And if you don't agree with the way I'm putting it, that's certainly fine. Tell me how you'd put it.
Yeah, just give me 1 minute. I'm sorry.
Oh, look at that.
So I figure it might be fun to finish in person. Hello.
Hi there.
Okay, sorry. Hi. All right. So I don't mean to overstate and say that every Lion is a consultant, because they are most definitely not. Gets back to the independent thing that I said earlier. Some are only interested in selling you an advertisement, and they will write their stories, and you have the privilege of advertising next to that story. And that's them. Not coincidentally, others, some of those people that have that arrangement are struggling and are struggling to develop new lines of business. And so it's my challenge to, I can try to, in other words, it's not my battle to tell them that they're wrong, because I'm not sure they are, but it's also not my place to tell them how to run their business. What I can do is say, there are lots of ways for you to try to make money. Here are the ones that you could possibly use. And that's how I see our role as an association, as a helper function, you know, as a not an advocate for any one tool, but as a provider, like an access point through which they can figure out multiple ways to derive revenue to do the news. Ultimately, though, that's our job, is to help them do the news. Because if you don't have a strong business side, you can't afford to cover things.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. And I just want to be clear, the premise of my question, my point wasn't specifically about what your role is with the Lion publishers, but
Right.
what in terms sort of publishing writ large today.
I think that's, I mean, the reason I mention it is because I'm encouraged by it. And I think it's a possible template from which others could, draw their own arrangements and figure out their own solutions. I think it's a smart way of solving a problem around a business. It's not going to work for everybody, but I'm encouraged by the fact that it's working there, and it's also working for a site called Buckrail, which covers. I used to say Montana, but I actually think it's not Montana. I gotta check and see where it is. But I'm encouraged by the stuff they're doing as well, because it is unusual. They started as a web development firm, and then they started doing the news because they just saw a need and filled it. I was introduced to them when I started doing the Newspack project, which is the Google funded WordPress.com project for small and medium publishers, and Buckrail was one of the initial applicants for that process. They actually pulled themselves out of contention because Newspack was a little too one size fits all for the stuff they want to do. But it was exciting to see cool experimentation happening in a place that I hadn't heard of,
So I just want to pause here and again, thank you for taking some time. I know you have a lot of things you could be doing besides spending an hour with students in the middle of the country, and I really appreciate it. Thought maybe what I could do is just ask if you had anything that you'd like to close with in the last minute or so. What would you, let me just give you some context here. The final project for these students is going to be to come up with some sort of business plan for an information business that they have some interest in starting.
Terrific.
So is there something that you would advise them to think about as they're
only
going?
That you were doing a lot of the work that our publishers did not do when they started. They hard way that it was a business. So by starting from a place where you're thinking about what your audience needs, where the gaps are and how to fill them, you're already ahead of a lot of publishers. And that's a good thing. I think that my goals for Lion are to instill this organization with an entrepreneurial spirit, that some of the most exciting work I've done is when I've talked to people who understood, like, the startup community is a community and people help each other. And we do that because we understand not everybody's going to make it. And that's the sort of implicit, I apologize for my barking dog. That's the implicit arrangement that you make as a startup. So if you're starting in a place where you're thinking about the audience's needs from the beginning, that's already a long way down the path. And good luck. I hope it's fun. It sounds like fun. And best of luck with it. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys.
I appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you for your time.
Would it be okay if they had any questions? Could they email you? Would that be?
Of course, yeah.
And I have your email address, so I'll make that available to the students then. All right. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
everybody. Take
Thanks.
care.
Have a good
Take care.
day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.